We're looking at Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. This is the second main sin. The first main sin is Adam's sin, seizing the forbidden fruit. He was an unfaithful son. Now we're going to see Cain as the unfaithful brother. Genesis 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Just read that far for the moment. Well, notice in this context here, the name Yahweh is used, the Lord in all caps. And so this is a covenant context. Interestingly, in the preceding chapter, when Eve refers to what God had told them, she just uses the word in chapter 3, verse 2, or verse 3, that God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree. That's the word Elohim. And when the serpent addresses her, he just uses the word Elohim. Now, in this context, Eve refers to God as Yahweh. When she bore Cain, she says, I've gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. She uses the covenant name. That's a significant feature. So this is all in the context of interpersonal relationship with God, wherein God reveals himself to man redemptively, and man is in relation with God. And so this is the context of Cain's rebellion. Well, notice that Cain's sin has to do with false worship and then with murder against his brother. First he comes, they come to worship, and Abel brings an offering of the flock. Why do you suppose he did that? Well, in the preceding chapter, God makes a covering of skins for Adam and Eve. They had tried to make a covering for themselves, didn't work. They had tried that with fig leaves, and then by hiding, in the shrubbery, as it were. Then God, after pronouncing the promise of the seed of the woman who would crush the seed of the serpent, takes and makes coverings of skins for them. That means an animal died, its blood was shed. And so Abel understood from this, I believe that Cain understood from this as well, that it's through the shedding of the blood of an innocent substitute that forgiveness of sins is granted. Looking forward in the unfolding history of the Bible, you see God instituted a sacrificial system. They were blood sacrifices. Okay? Now there were sacrifices that went with those, there were grain offerings and so on, but fundamentally they were the sacrifices that required the shedding of the blood, because it's the blood which is the life of the sacrifice which makes atonement for sin. So first of all, Cain, he's got a worship problem. Now there's been discussion down through the centuries. Was the problem his heart, or was the problem what it was he was offering? And this is one of those questions to which the answer is yes. He wasn't offering the right kind of offering, and that's because his heart was not right. If his heart was right, he would have offered the right kind of offering. Now, this is very important for us in our understanding of worship. We want to worship from a true heart, and that means we want to worship because we want to worship from a true heart. We want to worship according to the Word. And so it's not either or. One of the effects of the fall is we tend to split off heart and deed, heart and life. How many times have you heard someone say, who's doing something wrong, well, I know it's wrong, but God knows my heart? As if well, God knows my heart is really right with him. It's just I'm doing this thing that's wrong, but my heart's right with God. Well, how can that be? I mean, how would you take that personally? I know I'm lying and slandering about you, but my heart's right. Okay. Well, as long as I know that your heart's right, man, it's okay for you to go around and slander against me, and well, it's okay for you to steal from me, and you're an employer and you find out your employee is stealing from you, and he says, but boss, I really want you to know my heart's right. Okay. All right. Well, that makes everything okay. Well, of course not. Yeah, that's absurd. He wasn't worshiping God rightly because his heart wasn't right. If you're worshiping from a true heart, you'll want to worship the way God says to worship. And God tells us how to worship in the scriptures. Well, then that's the first aspect of it, and this is carried on throughout history. Problems in worship. Israel worships false gods, and God sends the prophets, and finally they stop worshiping false gods, but then they start worshiping false ways. So both those problems work out throughout history, worshiping false gods or worshiping the true God in a false way. They claimed they were worshiping God when they set up the golden calf. Didn't fly with God. It's the same thing as, God, our hearts were right. God didn't think so. He sent Moses down and judgment. All right, so the next thing then is his sin against Abel, his brother. Sins against God lead to sins against man. False worship leads to sins against man. Think about it. If a person is sinning against God, it shouldn't be any surprise they're going to sin against God's image. How you worship, what you worship, who you worship, and how you worship will have a direct bearing on the way you relate to your fellow man. Now, once again, this is totally foreign to the mindset of modern man, especially since the 18th century so-called Enlightenment. There's been this idea that you can have morality without God. Modern atheism really pushes this idea. The energetic and aggressive form of atheism we have today says, you can have morality without God. Well, sorry, you can't. In the history of mankind, argues that case quite forcefully. If you don't worship the living and true God in the right way, it's going to show up in your relations with man. Think about, for example, the 10 Commandments. What are the first 4 commandments about? About how you relate to God, and very much about how you relate to God in terms of worship. No other gods but the living and true God. You're not to worship God through idols, through images. You're not to use the name of the Lord in vain. You're to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and so on. Well, what's the second? What are the last 6 commandments about? Relations with how you treat one another. Yeah. Now, which comes first? Well, you start with honor your father and mother, right? And then you wind up with the commandments concerning God. It's totally the opposite. It begins with our relationship with God, and then talks about our relationship with man, because man is the image of God. Okay. Well, you see what happens here. Cain is not right with God, so he rises up and he kills his brother Abel. And this too is played out in the history of redemption. Later in the history of redemption, God comes and he chastises Israel through his prophets, and he condemns them for the way they're treating one another. You see, their break of fellowship with God results in their mistreating one another. They're oppressing the poor and things like that. What are we told in 1 John chapter 4, verse 10? And this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. The next verse says, "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." And he also tells us that don't say you love God if you don't love your brother. He says, he who doesn't love his brother whom he can see doesn't love God whom he can't see. You see how, again, throughout the whole of the history of salvation, these two issues are linked together, the primary one being our relation with God, and second, and flowing from our relation to God is our relation with our fellow men. How did Jesus summarize the whole law? First and greatest commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And then the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You see how this is illustrated over and over and over again. All right. Well, then God brings judgment against Cain. Pick that up in verse 9. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Now, notice how this is parallel to the judgment placed on Adam. The ground is going to resist his labors. Adam then is expelled. Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden into the land of Eden. Now he tells Cain, because you've spilled your brother's blood on the ground, and the blood of your brother cries out from the earth to me, it's going to resist your labors, and then you're going to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And so he's kicked out of the land. Adam was expelled from the garden. Cain then is expelled from the land. Look at verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you've driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. You see, he's exiled from the land. Okay, so he goes to the land of Nod and marries a wife. And one of the great questions is, well, where did he get his wife? Well, if you look at chapter 5, you see this. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made them in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. Well, this is the third statement about creation, isn't it? The first one is Genesis 1:26 to 28, where you have the description. God said, let us make man after our image, and then he created man, male and female, and so on. And that is placed in the context of man's relation to the rest of creation. He's the apex of creation. He's the ruler of creation under God. And so that's the purpose of Genesis chapter 1's statement about Adam, the creation of Adam and Eve. In the second chapter, it's narrowed down to a close-up of God forming man's body of the dust of the earth and then breathing the breath of life into his nostrils. And then later in the chapter, he takes from Adam's side and creates Eve. That's placed in the context of God's personal relationship with Adam, because he creates him and then he puts him in the garden, and then he says it's not good for man to be alone. He creates a helper corresponding to him and so on. So the second creation account has the purpose of focusing on man's personal relation with God. Well, then this third account is for what? Is to show genealogy, is to show the unfolding of Adam and his descendants, because it says in verse 3, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Notice he had other sons and daughters. We're not given their names. And then the same thing, when Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. So there were lots of people on the earth. This is where Cain got his wife. People, when they're living a lot of years like that. Plus, we live in a day where people have 1.5 children on average. Poor half kid, But in earlier times, people had, it wasn't uncommon, even a few generations ago, for people to have 6, 8, 10, 12 people, 12 children. All right, so anyway, that answers that question. Obviously, you could say a whole lot more, for our purposes, we're just picking up some of the main themes. We could talk about their longevity and so on, and maybe in the questions afterwards. But to keep a little bit focused here, this brings us to the Cainites and the Sethites and the third main sin. In Genesis 5, you have the descendants of Adam through Seth. And actually it picks up in 4 verse 25. Well, you know what, I'm rushing ahead of myself. We need to go back a little bit. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 17, after Cain went away to the land of Nod and he took a wife, it says he knew his wife, she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. The one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. Adah bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. All right, well, this is the line of Cain. Okay, what are the Cainites like? Well, they're very creative. They're very artistic. They're very inventive, from this brief description. But there's something else about the Cainite culture as revealed in the representative Cainite. Look at verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. This is a violent culture. It's an immoral culture. It's a polygamous culture. The representative Cainite has 2 wives, at least 2 are mentioned. Who knows how many he might have ended up with. 2 are mentioned, and he boasts to them of his violent revengefulness. So that tells you about the Cainite culture. Well, then in verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now this is the line of Seth, and these are people who call upon the name of the Lord. That could also be rendered proclaim the name of the Lord. This same language is used of Abraham when he enters the promised land. He sets up an altar and calls upon the name of the Lord, or proclaims the name of the Lord. So you have also a representative Sethite. Look at Genesis 5 verse 24. We'll pick it up at 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. And notice it says that Enoch walked with God. And then it says, thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. It says it a second time. And he was not, for God took him. So the representative Cainite is a man of whom it is spoken twice in this brief description. He's a man who walks with God. So what is the Sethite culture like? Well, these are the people of the Lord. So you have 2 lines. You have the ungodly line of the Cainites, and you have the godly line of the Sethites, people who are calling on the name of the Lord. 2 seed lines. All right, well then in Genesis 5, you have this genealogy. You have another genealogy in Genesis 11. Now these, for us, are kind of the boring parts of the Bible. In our modern translation, it says so-and-so lived so long and fathered so-and-so for so many years after that and had other sons and daughters. Well, in the Old King James, it's so-and-so begat so-and-so. So we call them the begatitudes. Yeah. We read through a few lines of this, and it starts to get to old for us real fast. But that's a reflection on us as modern people. other cultures, I remember reading about R.J. Rushdoony. He was a missionary to the Chinese in Southern California, and they found this to be very important. They have a strong tradition of ancestor veneration. Of course, with them it goes into false worship as well. But so Rushdoony found these genealogies to be helpful in evangelizing the Chinese. And there is a renewed interest in genealogy today. Now, these genealogies have a particular purpose, and there's a lot that could be drawn from them. We'll highlight a few aspects, but I want to just call your attention to a couple of things. Notice that it begins, Genesis 5 begins with Adam and then the line of Seth. Okay, where does it end up? Look at verse 32, with Noah and his sons, Shem and Japheth. Okay, so this genealogy establishes the continuity of the story from Adam to Noah and Noah's sons. Then if you look at chapter 11, you see in verse 10, these are the generations of Shem. Genesis 5 ended up with Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Well, Genesis 11 picks up the genealogy at chapter 11, verse 10 with Shem. And where does it end up? Well, it ends up with Abram. And then chapter 12 presents the call to Abram, who is later on called Abraham. So you see, these are important. What we're going to look at next is what happened to the Sethites, because in Genesis chapter 6 we read that in the time of Noah, the whole world was filled with wickedness and rebellion. That's why God decides to bring judgment on the whole world and save Noah and his family. Faithful Noah. He's described as being a perfect man who finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, the question is, what happened to the godly line of Seth? That the whole world became filled with wickedness, such that God decided to judge the world, saving only Noah and his family. We'll pick that up next time.